Okay, episode number 5, as I'm now beginning episode number 4 of the Jack Ryan series on Amazon. And it reminds me, after 9/11, Bush pushed through Congress the Patriot Act, and then after the fact, Congress realized that many of their rights were taken from them. And so they overturned little by little as they came to discover what Bush had overridden congressional rights in the Constitution. But a TV series began after Bush declared war on terror. And it's Kiefer Sutherland, a favorite actor of mine. He started a TV show called 24. And the major theme of 24 was that there is a serious threat of terrorism to the United States, and we have to suppress the terrorists at whatever cost. That was the general theme, because Kiefer Sutherland, in order to stop the terrorists, had to employ torture techniques to get information from sources in order to stop the terrorists and the terrorist attack. This is the alt-right conservative thinking. And we have since learned that torture interrogations are not effective. They're not reliable, and they're horrible. Not only for human rights violations, but when people are tortured to give information, they give false information just to stop the torture. They don't tell the truth about what the people are torturing them for, especially when they have no clue about any of the information. Bush rounded up Muslims and those who looked like Muslims into the prison camps, Guantanamo being the famous one. And they all justified it because we were attacked on 9/11 and we will not tolerate it. So he created an enemy, and it took him a while to figure out which enemy we would accept as Americans. For example, he blamed Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, yet alt-right conservatives still believed Saddam Hussein was directly responsible for 9/11. That's the mindset that I'm trying to warn about. They think whatever they want to achieve their agenda, and whoever they need to dehumanize, villainize, that's all just part of their operation. So Afghanistan, Russia said, yeah, good luck, we tried for decades and not get anywhere. Even sent in Boris and Natasha and they not do nothing. Bullwinkle and Rocky reference. Yeah, and America knew it. We knew Russia couldn't do anything in Afghanistan because of the mountainous terrains and the caves that they've made in the mountains. So it's very difficult to fight a war in Afghanistan. They're well fortified. They know their terrain. And then it helps when very few other governments know your language. And so after 9/11, the government of the United States had to put out a rush for applications for people to learn Arabic, and the specific dialects in the Middle East so that they can do espionage, spying activities out there, and have translators as part of the interrogation process. And so this is how governments function. They create a threat where there is none to justify beefing up security to defend the alt-right agenda, the alt-right laws. And that's where we come to Utah. Utah has been alt-right, like I said in the previous video, since Brigham Young. And when the United States government oppressed Brigham Young and his followers, it didn't stop his thinking. He still thought of himself as the ruler of the people, and the people still thought of him as their ruler. And so they had no respect for the United States, and the United States was just an oppressive regime trying to hurt them and suppress them. And that's why it took several attempts by the United States to stop polygamy among the Mormons, is because they didn't listen the first time, and so they had to do it a second time, and that's where the Reed-Smoot hearings in the Senate occurred. And the Mormons were finally forced to come out with their official declaration, number 1, because number 2 would have been when they gave blacks the priesthood again. And so, yeah, the Mormons never actually made it a new commandment to stop polygamy. They just put in an official declaration that they would conform to the United States government. And in that declaration, they also say that they will not encourage members of the church or teach it to the members of the church, except the Mormons still, in defiance, left in the section 132 of their Doctrine and Covenants, which encourages and outright says you can't get in to the Mormon highest heaven without polygamy. Section 132. That was put in by Brigham Young. He says it was Joseph Smith who wrote it, but Joseph Smith's commandment that he put in the Book of Commandments, which was a precursor to the Doctrine and Covenants, was the doctrine of one man, one woman. So Brigham Young is to blame for polygamy. And Mormons don't get that because the church has now thrown Joseph Smith under the bus on that. So Utah government. It's the same as other governments. They have a state governor, the legislature that make laws, and then counties and cities, and so it's the same function in all the other states for the most part. But like I said, the LDS Church controls what is passed as law in Utah, and they try to expand their influence to other states. For example, Proposition 8, the famous prop in California, the Mormon Church got busted for their illegal advertising campaign that they had run in California. But apparently they didn't get punished or held accountable. They just said, "Oops, sorry, did we do that?" And then they go and mess with the Colorado Baker case. So yeah, the Mormon Church wants to branch out and control other states. That is their agenda. And you can go back and listen to President Dallin H. Oaks in the first talk he gave on the Saturday morning session of the LDS General Conference. He directly talks about what he claims the church is opposed to: abortion, gays, euthanasia. He doesn't say suicide, he uses euthanasia instead. But that's what euthanasia is assisted suicide. So he's not coming out and saying suicide, but that's what he means. Suicide is also a sin in the LDS Church. And he's making up his own doctrines for the church, claiming that the church also believes this. And now he's in the first presidency of the church. So now what he says has a little more weight behind it, because Nelson always refers to him for doctrinal matters. Oaks, in his previous life, was a lawyer who became a judge. And so he knows all about law. He tried coming out with a book about the murder of Joseph Smith, because historians were finding out other details that contradicted the church's official position on that. And so Oaks took it upon himself to mediate, to create a different scenario that appealed to historians who were revealing and leaking things, and yet still keep the church clear from any wrongdoing in that. The thing is that it was found that Joseph Smith actually had a 6-shooter and shot 2 of the mob that came rushing up the stairs to get him. And it was told by the church previous to that time that there were no guns by Joseph Smith or any others in the jail. And my family knew otherwise, because my 3rd great-grandfather, John Solomon Fulmer, was the one who was in the jail with Joseph Smith overnight, and when given an assignment by Joseph Smith to go get the militia to make sure that he gets to court, my 3rd great-grandfather gave Joseph his single-shot pistol. So when I found out that it was a single-shot pistol that my 3rd great-grandfather had, and that Joseph Smith had a 6-shooter, I needed to find out more about what happened there. So I did my own research and found out, yeah, there was a conspiracy, and it was Brigham Young involved in orchestrating that. Utah government, they are big on police presence. Utah has probably the most different police divisions, forces, than any other state. I haven't compared, but that seems to be the case, because there's a police agency for all levels of government, and different agencies within each level of government. I'll skip ahead and give you a spoiler alert. I was arrested by the Utah government, and there were numerous agencies that showed up at my takedown arrest. So that, it's like supreme ultra-right conservative here. They enforce their laws upon the people with a direct police presence that patrol our streets regularly. In California, I didn't see police really patrolling my local neighborhood. I got pulled over for driving too fast delivering pizza. But otherwise, it's the highways where you see the police presence. But here in Utah, every day you can see cops driving by. That's part of their patrol. And each city has their own police force, but it all involves having a direct police presence on the streets and making their rounds. And that's part of the alt-right conservative thinking, is that the people are the threat, and we need to protect the people from themselves. And that's the one major tip-off to the alt-right conservatism that is in Utah. The other is that organizations, the religion, still tries to emulate a government agency. When I was arrested, the government charged me with a government charge, but it was for the church as the one responsible. So the government considered the church part of the government. That was a Freudian slip on behalf of the Attorney General here of Utah. That showed his hand in his corruption. And while I was incarcerated, he himself was taken to court for corruption charges when he was the Attorney General, but it didn't have to do with my case. So even though he got away with his corruption on the other case, he has numerous other charges if only the people could petition for a redress of grievances. And that's another part of the alt-right conservative governing system. They don't want us to have constitutional rights, because in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition for a redress of grievances, and yes, freedom of religion is also included. So 5 rights contained in the First Amendment. And they all interrelate. You can't separate freedom of religion from freedom of the press. But that's what the LDS Church wants to do, is separate religion and justify freedom of the press with their state press, the Deseret News. It is owned and operated by the church. It is, therefore, the state news, the state TV, the state press. And so freedom of the press is only granted in Utah as long as it's controlled and operated by the church, who controls the government. And so when Trump was locking babies in cages, the Deseret News did not cover the story until it became big news of opponents who were stopping the transportation of those babies to other locations in the United States secretly. There was an active attempt to prevent the secret transportation of babies throughout the United States. And that's when the Deseret News finally covered it, so that they can give their readers, who are alt-right conservatives for the most part, an understanding that those trying to stop the babies are the evil ones. They don't say it, but that's what they mean when they present the information the way they do, because locking babies in cages had been done for a long time, but the Deseret News didn't cover the issue until liberals stepped in to interfere. And so that's how it's portrayed, is that liberals are interfering with the Republican government. And you can read the comments on that news article. It's full of the alt-right hate. Immigrants are illegal. They're not refugees, they're illegal, they're animals, they deserve to be punished because they're illegal. That's the alt-right thinking. These are Mormons in the Deseret News comments. They're spouting the alt-right Trump agenda. And it's interesting because the Mormon Church, under President Hinckley, came out with a family proclamation. And yet, Mormons turned that into their alt-right thinking. So when it says that husbands and fathers have a responsibility to provide for the physical necessities of the family, Mormons, and by extension the Utah government, then require husbands and fathers to have a good paying job to provide a good suburban home with cars and food and clothing and everything for the children, when the reality is that the economy doesn't allow it. You have to be educated in order to get a good job, but you're deep in debt from your education. And so not everybody is able to afford an education to get deep in debt. And so the majority of Utahns are poor. And there's a housing crisis in Utah. And so as a result, many husbands and fathers are in violation of the family proclamation because they may have a job, or if it's part-time jobs, they have several part-time jobs, and it requires the wife to also work so that their combined income can make it so that they can survive check by check. That's the danger of alt-right thinking, is they provide conditions that cannot be obtained and then punish the people for not meeting the expectations that they rigged that cannot be met. That's the alt-right thinking. That was had by Thomas More's Utopia. He talks about that with the British government. And so this is not new. Alt-right thinking is not new. It's just the title of it, alt-right. That's a new word usage. But the meaning has always been around for a long time. And that's what Utah does. You know, those on welfare, they get less than minimum wage. Because Utah doesn't want to stand up for their poor's rights because they hate the poor. They're a burden on the economy. And they'd rather have them killed off and thus solve the problem. It's the human rights liberals that prevent them from killing them off and solving the problem as they see it. Because they think they can fix everything if they were just allowed to do whatever they want. That's their thinking. They don't see it as bad. They don't see it as wrong. They don't see it as evil. And so they claim that welfare is less than minimum wage as a deterrent, because they don't want to create a welfare state. And they don't get it. They blame the victims and keep them suppressed so that they remain victims, and then silence them when they rise up to protest. So the amendment, petition for a redress of grievances. If there is a complaint or an allegation of criminal behavior, we need to be able to go to our government and say, hey, I want to file charges. But when it's the government causing the abuse, who do we go to? Utah will not allow anybody to sue them. They have put laws in place to prevent that from happening and do all they can to protect themselves. So only if an officer really messes up in his position and gets exposed with recorded, documented evidence, the Utah government gets away scot-free. And even if a person were to win in a court case, the monetary compensation is limited so that they do not get all of the money, and it's only a certain amount that they would receive a month, and they can't go above that. And so when the period of time is up, that's all they get. And so there's limits on compensation for people, and that's to protect Utah, the government. And that's the alt-right thinking, is we are above the law, and therefore we need to protect ourselves from accusations that come before us so that we can remain in power, so that we don't get hurt and be held accountable for what's going on. And so people are denied petitioning for a redress of grievances. So those on welfare, they get less than minimum wage, because if they got a living wage, they would be able to save and thus be able to pay for an attorney to sue the government for abuses committed against them. And so what then do people do when they're denied petitioning for a redress of grievances? They protest. Utah has made laws trying to curtail, abridge the right to protest. They have zoned protesters. You have to apply to be able to protest and get approved by the government to protest. And then when you're approved, you are zoned to a location that will not influence the people you're protesting. So the LDS Church for General Conference, they had a zoned area for protesters, and it didn't interfere or be available to the majority of Mormons. When Trump came to Utah, the protesters were zoned to a park that Trump never drove past or was around. And so if you watch the news in Utah, there were rebels who found out that Trump was going to visit Welfare Square of the church, and the neighbor right across the street found out about it, that her home was going to be on Trump's route, and so she protested with signs in her yard and at her fence, and others found out and gathered at her property to protest as Trump drove by. And so they were able to get away with it because it was on her personal property. And but that's what Utah did, is that the official organized protest was zoned to a park that Trump would never even find out about. And that's what they do here in Utah. They silence people who are victims. They silence people who complain that their rights have been violated. And that's the alt-right conservative agenda. They try to control behavior. And I will get into that when I talk about my situation, which I think can be next, in the next video section. And it includes psychiatry as well in that, unless I have to make psychiatry its own separate one. So we'll see on the next video, number 6.